This is the story of George Allen Whitfield and his wife Margaret Ellen Whitfield. They had built a life the way most people build lives, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with accumulated mornings, with coffee cups left in specific places, with the particular way George always backed the car out of the driveway while Margaret locked the front door. For 38 years, this was love in its most functional form, present, reliable, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, hollowing out at its center. The tension between them was never loud. It lived in the pauses, in the things neither of them said at dinner, in the way Margaret had learned to read George's silences as either contentment or withdrawal, and had long since stopped trying to distinguish between the two. What would unravel? What had perhaps already begun unraveling before George heard those words on the phone was not their marriage, but something more precise, his understanding of who his family had quietly become while he was still looking at the version of them he preferred to see. This is a story about the cost of believing what is comfortable and the strange, heavy peace that arrives when you finally stop. The roses along the back fence had needed cutting for 3 weeks. George noticed this every morning when he took his coffee to the kitchen window, the same window where he'd stood for 22 years, ever since they'd moved into the house on Claremont Drive after Kyle started middle school. The roses had been Margaret's project. She planted them the spring after her mother died. Something to tend, she'd said, something that would come back every year regardless. But Margaret's knees had worsened over the past 2 winters, and the roses had grown past tending into something wilder, the canes crossing and reaching in directions that made the whole bed look anxious. George thought about cutting them back himself. He thought about it the way he thought about many things these days, carefully, repeatedly, and without acting. He was 67 years old. He had retired 14 months ago from a 40-year career in commercial real estate, and he still hadn't entirely located himself in the silence that retirement left behind. He filled his mornings with the newspaper and his afternoons with projects that he researched thoroughly and completed about half of. He had converted the garage into a workshop. He had installed a drip irrigation system for Margaret's vegetable beds. He had purchased and partially read 4 books on woodworking. Margaret moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with doing things herself. She was 64, still sharp in the way that people who read constantly tend to be sharp. Her mind making connections her mouth didn't always bother to voice. She taught a Tuesday morning watercolor class at the community center, which she'd been doing for 6 years. And she met her friend Diane for lunch on alternating Thursdays. She had built, in other words, a life inside their life. George admired this about her, though he rarely said so. Admiration, in their marriage, tended to express itself as assumption, the assumption that the other person knew. They were not unhappy. This was perhaps the most difficult thing to explain to anyone who hadn't lived inside a marriage like theirs. It was possible to be not unhappy and still feel the particular loneliness of being consistently gently not quite seen. Kyle called on Sunday afternoons. He was 39, a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm in Phoenix, and he had his father's tendency toward planning and his mother's tendency toward emotional avoidance, which made him, in many ways, a competent and somewhat opaque person to love. He had married Amber 6 years ago. They had no children. They had, instead, a lifestyle that required maintenance. A house in a neighborhood that was slightly beyond their means, cars that were leased, vacations that were photographed carefully and posted before they were fully felt. George liked Kyle in the straightforward way that fathers like sons who have turned out functional. He found Amber more difficult to like, though he would not have said so, and had worked with some success at not examining this feeling too closely. She was pleasant in the practiced way that made pleasantness feel like a policy. She asked about his health, remembered the names of his projects, said the right things about Margaret's cooking. But there was something in the way she listened, or didn't quite listen, something in the slight angle of her attention that reminded George of the clients he'd most mistrusted during his career, the ones who smiled through valuations, who were always more interested in what something was worth than in what it was. He told himself this was unfair. He told himself this regularly, That Sunday, Kyle called at the usual time, 4:15, which was always a little later than he said he would. George was in the workshop, doing nothing in particular, running his hand along the plank of walnut he'd bought 3 months ago and not yet cut. "Dad," Kyle said, "how are things?" "Things are things," George said, which was the answer he gave when he didn't want to require anything of the conversation. They talked for 11 minutes. Kyle mentioned a problem at work, a subcontractor who was behind schedule. George mentioned the irrigation system. Neither of them mentioned Margaret, except when Kyle asked, as an afterthought near the end, "Mom doing okay?" And George said, "She's at Diane's," which answered a different question but seemed to satisfy Kyle regardless. It was when Kyle said, "Hold on a second, Dad," and set the phone down without muting it. George could hear the particular hollow sound of a phone placed on a hard surface. That George heard Amber's voice from another room. She wasn't speaking to him. She didn't know he was listening. She said, "Did you ask him yet? About the investments?" "Kyle, we need to know what he's planning to do with all of that before he does something stupid with it." George stood in his workshop with the phone against his ear and his hand still on the walnut plank. Kyle's voice, lower. "Not now. Amber, we should at least know where we stand. It's not unreasonable." Then Kyle picked up the phone and said, cheerfully, "Sorry about that." "So, irrigation system. Tell me how that turned out." George told him. He kept his voice exactly as it had been before. He did not let anything shift. He was good at this. Had always been good at this, the maintenance of surface while something else was happening underneath. After he hung up, he stood in the workshop for a long time. The walnut plank was smooth under his palm. Outside, through the small window above his workbench, he could see the roses along the back fence. All that unguided reaching. He thought, "I am not surprised." And that, in its own way, was the sharpest thing. He didn't tell Margaret. Not that night, not the following week. This was not a decision he made consciously, exactly. It was more that the information took up residence in him quietly, the way a low-grade ache does, present, shaping behavior in small ways, not yet demanding to be named. He watched himself over those weeks with a kind of detached curiosity. He was sleeping the same hours, eating the same meals, moving through the house in the same patterns. But something had reorganized itself behind his eyes. He noticed things differently. The way Kyle's name appeared on his phone screen now produced a faint tightening in his chest before he answered. The way he found himself, once pausing outside the study where Margaret sat reading, watching her through the half-open door, trying to determine what she knew and what she only suspected. Because Margaret was not unobservant, this was something both men in her life had always slightly underestimated. She looked up from her book and found him in the doorway. "You look like you have something to say," she said. "I was just going to see if you wanted tea." She studied him for a moment, the particular study of someone who has 38 years of reference data and knows how to read the inconsistencies. "Okay," she said finally, "tea would be nice." He made the tea. He brought it to her. They watched an hour of television afterward, sitting in their respective chairs with the lamp between them. And George felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, the distance between them. Not hostile distance, not cold distance, but the gentle, accumulated distance of two people who had slowly, over many years, stopped reaching across. He thought, when did this happen? He knew, of course, that this was not a thing that happened at a moment. It was a thing that happened continuously, invisibly, in the spaces between moments. It happened when you chose the workshop over the kitchen. When you said, "She's at Diane's," instead of talking about what your wife was actually like, when you answered things are things, to avoid having to be known. He understood, not only a man whose son's wife had said something revealing on an open phone line. He was a man who had contributed, in his own quiet and respectable ways, to a family that had learned to operate its surfaces. 2 weeks after the call, Kyle and Amber came for the weekend. This had been planned for over a month. Amber had messaged Margaret about it, chosen dates, suggested she and Margaret could visit the botanical garden. The weekend arrived, with the specific weather of late October in their part of Virginia. that cool, colored light that makes everything look like a memory of itself. Amber wore a cream-colored sweater and brought a bottle of wine she described as actually really good. She was attentive to Margaret in the way that George had come to recognize as performance, the right questions asked, the listening face held at the correct angle. She called him George rather than Dad, which he always had and which George had never commented on, and which he noticed now with fresh attention. Dinner was beef tenderloin, which Margaret made beautifully and never without considerable effort, though she would deflect any compliment about it with "it's just a method." They sat at the dining room table, which they only used when Kyle visited, and the conversation moved through the standard territories. Kyle's project, Amber's redesign of the back patio, a neighbor's renovation that had been going on for 8 months. Then Amber said lightly, "George, I've been meaning to ask, have you given any more thought to what you're doing with the Reynolds portfolio?" The Reynolds portfolio was a collection of commercial properties George had spent 20 years assembling. It was his most significant asset. He had never discussed it in detail with Kyle or Amber. He looked at her. He kept his face pleasant and still. "A bit," he said, "because Kyle was saying you might be thinking about restructuring." She glanced at Kyle, who was looking at his plate with the careful attention of a man who knows he is in a moment he did not fully sanction. "We just want to make sure. I mean, it would be good to understand the overall picture, for planning purposes." George picked up his wine glass. "That makes sense," he said. Margaret was watching him, not Amber him. He had caught something in the word makes or in the 3-second pause before it. "It's just that these decisions get complicated," Amber continued, and her voice had that particular quality of someone who has rehearsed this, who has thought through the casual approach. "And sometimes it helps to have everyone aligned early rather than." "Amber," Kyle said quietly. She paused, reset, smiled. "I'm just saying it's worth a conversation." "It is," George agreed. He set down his glass. He looked at his son, at Kyle, who had his mother's eyes and his father's hands and who was, George thought, not a bad man, just a man who had learned to let things happen around him. And he said, "Why don't we talk after dinner?" After dinner, they sat in the living room. Margaret had gone upstairs with the polite and exact timing of a woman who understands when her absence is the most loving thing she can offer. Kyle and Amber sat together on the couch. George sat across from them in the chair he always sat in, the one with the worn armrest that Margaret had been suggesting they reupholster for 2 years. Kyle said, "Dad, look, I want to be upfront. Amber and I have just been thinking about the future. Your future, too." "We thought, I know what you thought," George said, not harshly, quietly. Kyle stopped. George looked at Amber, then at his son. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I'd like an honest answer." A pause. "When you think about the properties, the accounts, the portfolio, what do you imagine that situation looks like?" "Currently," Amber said carefully, "I mean, we understand there are assets. We just don't have a clear picture of how liquid they are," George said. She blinked. "We weren't going to say it that way, but that's the question." Silence. Kyle was looking at the floor. George nodded slowly. Then, and it was here that the moment became strange, became briefly something other than what it was, like a film frame held too long. He looked up, past both of them, slightly toward the middle distance of the room, and said, as if to no one in particular, "I don't know. Maybe like this story or subscribe or something." Amber frowned. "Sorry?" Kyle looked up. George blinked. His expression settled back into itself, composed and careful, as if the interruption hadn't happened, as if a small window had opened and closed in under 2 seconds. "Sorry," he said. "I was thinking of something else." He looked at them both. "What I was going to say is, the situation looks different than you may be imagining." He did not tell them everything that night. He told them enough. He explained in the measured and deliberate way of a man who had once made his living explaining financial structures to people who would rather not understand them, that the Reynolds portfolio had been placed into a family trust 18 months ago. that the trust had a corporate trustee, a private fiduciary firm in Richmond, and a structure that allowed distributions at George's direction during his lifetime, with provisions for Margaret and specific charitable designations after. That there was no liquid access for any other party without his explicit authorization. He did not tell them he had done this partly because of Amber. He told himself this wasn't true and almost believed it. The real reason, or the reason he allowed himself, was that his estate attorney, a precise woman named Carolyn Marsh who had known George for 15 years, had recommended it. People's intentions shift, Carolyn had said once, in that dry, effectless way of hers. Structures are more reliable than intentions. George had thought about that sentence for years. Amber, sitting across from him, processed this information the way certain people process being told no, with a stillness that was not calm, a face that was working to remain what it had been before the news. "So what does that mean?" she said finally. "Practically." "It means what I explained," George said. "The assets are managed by the trust. I have full authority over the trust. That's the practical meaning. But for Kyle, there's a provision, yes." George looked at his son. "Kyle knows he's named. It's not a mystery." Kyle had not spoken for some time. He was sitting forward now, elbows on his knees, hands loosely folded. He had the look of a man doing interior reckoning. Not anger, not calculation. Something more uncomfortable than either. Something that looked like recognition. "Dad," he said, and then stopped, as if the sentence he'd started had turned out to be the wrong one. "You don't have to say anything tonight," George said. And he meant it. He was not interested in extraction. Amber said, "I just want you to know that this wasn't." She paused, started over. "We weren't trying to." Amber, George's voice was not unkind. "You were trying to understand what you might have access to. I understand that. People think about these things. It's not shameful to think about money." He looked at her steadily. "It's only the way of it that matters." The way of it landed somewhere. He saw it in the slight shift of her posture, the way she sat back a half inch. Margaret came downstairs at 9:15 with an offer of decaf that everyone accepted, and the conversation moved, with a kind of collective relief, into ordinary territory. The botanical garden, the renovation next door. Kyle mentioned something about a colleague's promotion that seemed to require no response. When Kyle and Amber went upstairs, George sat alone in the living room for a while. Margaret appeared in the doorway. She looked at him with the full attention she so rarely directed at him anymore, or that he so rarely made himself available to receive. "How long have you known?" she asked. Known what specifically? She considered this. That she was looking. George was quiet. "Long enough," he said. Margaret nodded. She came and sat on the couch, not in her usual chair, but the couch closer to him than her habit. She picked up her book and opened it but didn't read. They sat like that for a while, not talking, and it was not the silence of absence. It was something else, something older, something that had been waiting underneath the accumulated distance for a moment to re-emerge. George felt it without looking at it directly. The way you feel warmth from a source you're not facing. He said, "I should have talked to you about all of it earlier." She turned a page she hadn't read. "Yes," she said, "you should have. I thought I was protecting you." "I know." She didn't look up. "You tend to think that." It was not forgiveness. It was not accusation. It was the exact thing a person says when they have been waiting a long time to say something true and have finally found a version of it that doesn't require anyone to be destroyed. Outside, the October night pressed against the windows. The roses would need cutting before the first frost. By January, Amber had developed a narrative. George understood this not because anyone told him directly, but because of the way information travels in families. Obliquely, in the half-stories people tell about other things. His sister-in-law Barbara, Margaret's younger sister, mentioned at a birthday gathering that she'd spoken with Kyle recently and that he'd seemed stressed about family stuff. A friend of Margaret's who knew Amber tangentially mentioned that Amber had, said something at a dinner party about complicated dynamics with in-laws who don't really understand how things work now. George filed these observations without attaching too much weight to them. He knew what they were: the early architecture of a revised story, one in which Amber and Kyle were the clear-eyed, reasonable ones who had simply wanted to plan responsibly, and George was the withholding patriarch who had chosen secrecy and control over family trust. There was, he admitted to himself, enough partial truth in this version to make it adhesive. He had kept things private. He had made decisions unilaterally. He had, for most of Kyle's adult life, communicated through provision rather than conversation, paying for things, arranging things without ever quite sitting down and saying, "Here is what I have, here's what I think, here is who I am, and what I'm afraid of." This was the thing about family grievances that made them so hard to resolve. They were almost never entirely wrong. Amber's instinct that she was being kept at a distance was accurate. The interpretation that this distance was adversarial, that the trust structure was punitive, was where the truth ended and the narrative began. Kyle called less frequently in those months. When he did call, the conversations had the careful quality of interactions between people who have decided, tacitly, to stay in the shallower water. He asked about George's health. George asked about the project. They spoke about football for a few minutes because it was available and required nothing. George began in this period to cut the roses. He did it on a Tuesday in late November, just before the first hard frost, wearing work gloves and moving methodically through the bed with his bypass pruners. It was harder than he'd expected. Not physically, though his shoulders ached by the time he finished, but in some other register. Margaret had planted these. They were hers in the way that things a person tends become theirs. He felt something adjacent to transgression and something adjacent to tenderness, performing this care on her behalf. She came out while he was working and stood at the edge of the garden with her hands in her cardigan pockets. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know." She watched him work for a few minutes. She said, "Kyle texted me." "What did he say?" "He said he's sorry things have been strange. He said he wants to bring it up properly when they visit at Christmas." She paused. "He said Amber is working through some things." George kept pruning. "That's good," he said. And he meant it, without fully knowing what he was meaning it about. Margaret was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You know, I used to be angry at you, for a long time." He stopped cutting, looked at her. "Not for this," she said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of everything that had happened in the last few months. "For other things, earlier things." She shrugged inside her cardigan. "I don't think I ever told you that. I just stopped being angry at some point. But I also stopped telling you things." He thought about this. He said, "I stopped asking." "You did," she agreed. This was not a confession. It was not a repair. It was two people in their late 60s in a garden in November, acknowledging a shape that had formed over decades and that could not be undone but might, carefully, be examined. He thought about all the mornings at the kitchen window, all the ways a person stands watching something that needs tending and thinks about it instead of beginning. "I'm going to ask," he said. "More." She looked at him for a moment. His weathered face, his careful eyes, his posture that had always been slightly guarded, even when he was trying to be open. She seemed to be considering the offer. "All right," she said, "then I'll answer." Inside, the house held its warmth. The pruned roses, bare-stemmed and stubbed back, had the austere, hopeful look of things prepared to come back. Christmas came and then passed. Kyle and Amber arrived on the 23rd and left on the 26th. They stayed in the guest room where they always stayed, and the house held all four of them in the way that houses hold things, structurally, indifferently, providing space for whatever the people inside choose to do with it. The visit was not warm exactly, it was considered. There was a quality of mutual effort to it that George found, in its own way, more moving than warmth would have been. Because effort is a choice, and choice implies that the alternative was considered and rejected, and that rejection meant something. Amber did not raise the portfolio. She did not raise anything adjacent to it. She cooked with Margaret on Christmas Eve, a thing she had never volunteered to do before. And George heard them in the kitchen, not the words, but the rhythm of it, the back and forth of two women being careful with each other in a small space. It was not friendship. It was not yet anything he had a name for. It was the first tentative evidence that two things could occupy the same room without one consuming the other. Kyle came into the workshop on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, while Amber and Margaret were cooking and the house smelled of rosemary and butter. He stood in the doorway the way George had stood in Margaret's doorway that evening in the fall, looking in, not quite entering. "What are you making?" he asked. George looked at the walnut plank, finally on the workbench, finally being shaped. "A box," he said, "for your mother, for her paints." Kyle came in. He picked up a scrap of walnut, turned it in his hands. He had George's hands, broad, steady, the hands of a person who might have worked with them more than he did. "Dad," he said. "Yeah, I should have." He stopped, started differently. "I let things go in directions I should have caught." George kept sanding. "You're here," he said. "That's something. Is it enough?" George thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about what enough meant, whether it was a fixed point you could locate or a moving condition, something you kept working toward in the particular direction that your life's damage and your life's love pointed you. "Ask me again in a year," he said. Kyle set down the wood scrap. He laughed, a small real sound, unperformed. "Okay," he said. "Okay." They left on the 26th in the morning, the car loaded with the specific collection of things that people carry home from their parents' houses. Leftovers in containers, a bottle of wine that was too good to open now, a wrapped package from Margaret that Amber held in her lap for the photograph they took by the door. George and Margaret stood in the driveway and watched the car back out. Amber waved through the window. Kyle honked once, slightly, the way he always did. The street was quiet. A neighbor's dog moved across a lawn somewhere. The sky was the flat white of December. Margaret slipped her hand into his. Not a dramatic gesture, a habitual one, or rather a reclaimed one, something they'd done without thinking for years, and then, somewhere in the drift of decades, had stopped. Her hand was cool from the morning air. His was warm from coffee. They stood there for a moment, not talking. He thought about the phone call, the one in October, the one he hadn't told her about for 2 weeks, the one that had started all of this. He thought about how strange it was. The thing that had finally cracked things open had been something overheard, accidental, outside of intention, not a revelation he had sought or a confrontation he had initiated, just a phone set down on a hard surface, and the particular hollow sound of it, and a woman's voice in another room saying, "We need to know what he's planning to do." And then Carolyn Marsh's voice from years ago underneath it. Structures are more reliable than intentions. He had built structures, legal ones, financial ones, and they had held, but standing here now in his driveway, with Margaret's hand in his, he thought about the other structures, the ones you build from attention and honesty, from the habit of asking and answering, from mornings spent at the window finally saying aloud that you notice what needs tending. Those structures he had let go unmaintained. He was still learning if they could hold weight again. "Come inside," Margaret said. "It's cold." "Yeah," he said. "In a minute." She went inside. He stood a moment longer. The roses along the back fence were cut back to their stubs, waiting. The street was ordinary and quiet, and his. There was no resolution he could point to, no clean line to draw. There was only the particular shape of a life, and the decision, made daily and imperfectly, about whether to keep living inside it honestly. He turned and went inside. The door closed behind him. The house held its warmth.